Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I am joined, as always, by my friends and yours, Mr. Scott Edberg and Jared Nelson. We are glad to be together. We've been very happy to be going through the PCA Book of Church Order Directory for Worship over the last several weeks, and we are going to continue doing that, but we're going to take a break for an interview with a new friend of ours that we want to introduce you to, and we want you to know about resource that he's providing that you can get through the PCA bookstore. And well, I won't say any more than that right now, but let me just check in with the guys. Jared, Scott, how are y'all doing? You hanging in there? Is it still icy?
The snow has melted where we're from, and we're kind of turning third base on our church renovation. It seems like it's never ending, but they're painting walls and installing lights even as we speak right now. And so we're hoping that within the next 30 to 45 days, we'll exit the school that we've been worshiping at for the better part of 3 or 4 years, and we'll get our own place of worship. And so it's exciting.
And we just recently ordained 2 new deacons. So the topic today will be fresh and helpful for me about what I should have done.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a little too late in many ways, I'm sure. Well, I just want to take a personal privilege and say thank you to all of the folks out there who've been praying for my daughter Maggie over the last many months. This is, I don't know exactly when this is going to air, but as of today on, February 12th, she had another checkup and needed no infusions. Her blood is producing what it's supposed to be producing, and it's fantastic. And it's like watching a miracle happen in live stream. It's pretty fascinating. She's bullying her sisters like every baby sister should, and running the house. And so things are feeling a little more normal. And we're glad and appreciate everybody's encouragement and engagement on all that. So thank y'all. We have John Stoddard with us. Did I say your last name right? I don't know how else I would say it. I don't even know why I asked you that question. Welcome. We are glad you're with us. You have authored a book called Lead My Sheep, A Guide for Training Elders and Deacons. And I'm going to say it right now. I'm going to put the link in the show notes. So listeners, y'all go buy a copy and take a look at it. And then keep listening and be even more interested in it as we talk. But John, will you do us a favor and just introduce yourself to us, give us a little context, who you are, where you're from, what are you doing, and then maybe tell us a little bit about how the book came to be and you know, your thoughts on it and your purpose and all those kinds of things. Is that too broad, too vague? Come on.
Nope, I'll do it. Just cut me off if I talk too long.
Talk for a while, yeah.
Well, welcome. Thanks, guys. It's a privilege to be on here and talk about this. I'm a pastor of PCA church out in Utah in West Jordan called Jordan Valley Church. We're just south of Salt Lake, and this summer will mark 13 years out here. It's actually the only call I've ever had, and Lord willing, I'd love to spend my entire time in one church. And so far, the Lord's been really good to us. And just a little personal info. Yeah, love Utah. Grew up in Colorado. Actually was born in New York State, but don't remember much. Lived in Alaska for a few years, then grew up in Colorado. And my wife and I wanted to get back to the West after seminary. I went to Westminster in Philly. And Utah is a lot like Colorado, so we've settled down here, got 4 kids, and God's been good to us. And really the church story is part of what led to this book. So I came out to do a church planting apprenticeship and potentially plant a church in the area. And long story short, I ended up taking over as the pastor from the man who had planted this church amid some scandal and just some other messiness, and inherited a group of elders and deacons. And probably like most guys, there were some that were good. There were some that maybe shouldn't have been there. A lot of them were perhaps morally qualified, but didn't necessarily know how to do the job. And through some of just the turmoil, those first couple of years, ended up having all the elders and deacons resign. So basically became like a church plant, and in the Lord's kind of mysterious providence, ended up planting a church, just not the one I was thinking I would plant. And it was in that I really just started thinking a lot about how do you do a better job of selecting and training men to serve as elders and deacons in the church. So I'd seen little bits of the great blessing that they could be, and yet it seemed like more often than not, there was just a lot of difficulty that came with it. Rarely did guys feel like their elders or deacons were true partners in ministry. And so started just studying that, thinking through it, and then developed a training program when we essentially reparticularized the church, which was in 18. And out of that training program, that went really well, ran it a few more times, and that's what led to me writing this book.
No, I'm gonna let
My first question is more of a framing question, and that is, we in our church, we just installed and ordained 2 new deacons and went through training process with them. But I wonder, do you think that training is something that is just like, okay, if I have new ones and then otherwise I don't think about it, or is this something that could be used for ongoing training? Like, do you think that like every 5 years you should pick up this book again and go through it again? Or is this just something you kind of do at the beginning and then kind of move on from there?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I've never quite been asked that. So I would say yes and no, right? Like, kind of one of the principles in the book that I think is really important is that the training process needs to kind of make sure people are morally qualified. That's the foundation. But it's not just having that moral qualification that means someone is called to serve as an elder and deacon. They also need to have, in addition to the character, they need to have the capacity and the calling, which I kind of focus on in that internal desire, because that external calling will come later with the congregational vote. And so I think the training program does a great job of vetting guys that have the character qualifications, have that internal sense of calling, and have the capacity to do the work. Now, if you come into an existing church where maybe you aren't sure about that, I think absolutely this could be something that could be good to help get someone on the same page. Because I talk in the book, it's maybe one of the mistakes we often make is just think if someone checks the character qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1, well, then they should serve. But that's the foundation. You can't skip that. But that's only the foundation. You need the rest of it to be in place to really have a fruitful team. And so I think, depending on your situation, it might be good to not necessarily go through the entire thing, but reassess some of those things to make sure everyone's aligned. People still feel that sense of calling, stuff like that.
Okay. And then my really first question to get into it, some people may think, well, okay, I'll read through the confession and the BCO with them. That'll be my training. But so having a guide like this, what do you think is a most overlooked element of training that you get if you have more of a program to do it rather than just read through these things and then you're fine?
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think that's probably what a lot of officer training tends to look like. And the problem with that is it's not actually having them do the job they're going to be called to do. Right. And so I make the analogy that if you look at the process for, say, calling a teaching elder in the PCA, there are those more academic requirements, right? Like you do have to have your seminary degree. You do have to have knowledge of the original languages. You do need to be able to pass some theology tests. But there's all this other stuff in there, like the internship, everything included under that, the process of coming under care. No congregation is going to call a pastor without hearing them preach. You have to be able to give a sermon at the presbytery when you're wanting to get licensed. So there's this whole practical aspect of it, right? But then if you just look at the way the BCO is currently written, there's not much of that practical aspect required for those that are calling to serve as a ruling elder or deacon. And so I think they can sometimes feel a little bit of whiplash where all the training was very focused on, I think everyone covers the character and then kind of put it simply head knowledge stuff, right? Reading the BCO, reading the confession. But then there's this huge gap of the actual practical application of that ministry. And I think that's what can lead to pastors and elders in particular sometimes having some tension, even not intentionally, where most pastors want to see their elders more proactive in ministry stuff, right? Going out, visiting shut-ins, helping with counseling, giving spiritual counsel, but they weren't necessarily trained for that in the training process. And so I'd say that's the key thing is you want to make sure in the training process that you have them actually do the ministry that you're going to be calling them to do so that A, they can decide whether they like it or not, and B, the congregation can see to be able to assess whether they have some of those gifts and make an informed vote at the end of the process.
Yeah, is that part of sometimes you're training, there's one new elder that's coming in. And so you're training the elder individually. What's the element then of the plurality of elders and how that comes in?
Yeah. So a couple things with that. I think I've found it's helpful to do the training with a couple of guys. And now I realize not every church is able to do that. But one thing that I do encourage churches in is that I think we sometimes have the funnel inverted for how we think about the training process. So in my experience, there tends to be a fair, like if you think of the funnel with the narrow part and then the wide part, right? I think most churches almost have the narrow part up top in terms of a high bar for nominating people. And they put too much emphasis on that and turn that into almost a separate like vetting stage. Whereas I argue that you want to flip that funnel. So the wide part is people can nominate all kinds of people and have a lower bar and then let the process vet out so that at the end of that, generally in our training, about 50% of the people that meet the nomination requirements, only about 50% of them make it through the end. Whereas with most officer training, I see few people get nominated. But if you kind of make it through that first part of being nominated, it's 90% chance you're going to make it through the rest unless there's some glaring thing. And so I think maybe one of the solutions to that is we've made the nomination process too restrictive. You open that up, you might be surprised who gets nominated. And that allows some of that plurality because there's something really fun and beneficial about going through it with a couple of other guys.
I'll let Scott ask a question.
Yeah, so, we've talked about character a little bit, but how, in the nominating process, what sort of tips could you give pastors and sessions in helping evaluate and test the character of the individual that may be elected?
Yeah. So I would say, just again, going on that previous point, I don't think it's good to put it on the congregation to test their character in when they're making nominations, right? Now, they know people, so they'll go off that. But for instance, I don't think it's a great idea to preach a sermon on like 1 Timothy 3 on the Sunday that you're opening up nominations, which I realize a lot of people do. But I think that kind of sends the wrong message of what nominations are for. You can't just test the character based off, a one-off Sunday or this or that. So the process is the test of the character, the training process is. And so there's a couple of aspects to that. And so in the book, I break out training into a couple different phases. So phase 1 is called the vetting phase, where we're really wanting to check character and calling and capacity. And so there's some practical things, right? Like we go through the qualifications in 1 Timothy, have guys do a self-assessment. And I've got copies of all this in the book, but then also I have a website, howtotrainelders.com, which has these electronic resources, which you can grab for free. So you can see our things. So people do a personal character evaluation, but then we send a character evaluation to their spouse if they're married that they don't see unless the spouse gives us permission, asking things in line with 1 Timothy 3, like, is your husband gentle, not quarrelsome? What's his relationship to money? What's his relationship to alcohol, stuff like that. And then we also give us a contact for like a neighbor or coworker or someone to do a character evaluation as well, tied into, in 1 Timothy 3, it talks about the elders well respected by outsiders, right? So outsiders should be able to get some view of their character. And so based on those three things, their personal review, the spouse's review, and then a peer review, that generally gives us a pretty good sense, at least on some red flags. And typically there's something that comes up in there that warrants further conversation, and a handful of guys will drop out. But the other part of that character test is the rest of the training process, because at least the way that I recommend doing it, it's a lot of work. And that's where you get to see things like, how does this person handle having to read a couple hundred pages on top of their full-time job and turn in a book report on it? How do they handle that type of stress? And how they handle that is a great indicator of how they're going to handle, if they're having to write up the minutes. If they're late on turning in reports, well, they're probably going to be late on turning in session minutes. And so seeing them in the work is a great way to examine their character. And then it's a lot easier to have these candid conversations about this stuff in the training process instead of 6 months after they've been ordained to the office and you're frustrated because they're always, not doing the things they said they would do.
Yeah. Something I was kind of curious about, because I had this before where somebody was nominated to be an officer and in the midst of the training decided, I don't think I'm actually qualified for this, I'm qualified for that. So I mean, do you think it's helpful at the beginning to say you're going to be nominated, or you're going to be doing training for elder, or you're going to be doing training for deacon, right? Or should you just kind of start with a training process and then after a while say, okay, I think your actual calling is more ministry of deed or ministry of word, right, once you're in the middle of that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I've moved more towards encouraging the congregation to just nominate people that they think could be good in these roles, but we hold that loosely. And so we have a checkbox. Someone can get nominated for elder, deacon, or unsure is the third checkbox. And typically, the best way to help figure that out is let them start doing that work and see which resonates with them. So we had one guy, because there's a lot of overlap, right? So we had one guy who was qualified, had some gifts for teaching, but also had some diaconal gifts. And so he was doing some of the work for both tracks, deacon and elder. And he did a good job, but it was interesting because when he was doing some of the elder stuff, like I think he was preparing some Sunday school materials to teach, his wife was getting annoyed with him because he was taking forever to do it. And he realized he could do it, but it just didn't come naturally. Whereas the deacon stuff was a little more life-giving, came a little more naturally. And so based on that, we encouraged him to continue down that deacon track. And so I think there is value not getting guys locked in too early, but let them test their gifts, see what they enjoy, see what they feel called to.
Yeah, and if you're in a small church and you don't necessarily know, you're like, there's nobody that just pops out. I mean, we've had this sometimes at session meetings where we're like, who are we seeing that might be a potential for a leader? And nobody pops out. How do you actually like kind of create some sort of an opportunity to see that? Maybe just like, well, they haven't had any opportunities, or, you know, what do you have them do in order to make those opportunities emerge, to see if somebody's like, okay, we hadn't thought about that guy before, but maybe that would be a good guy for deacon or elder.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple things. I mean, one is, I just think an easy thing we overlook is praying publicly for God to give the gifts to the church that he's promised to give in terms of church officers, right? Specifically elders. I think he can call deacons into that as well. And I've just seen over and over when you're praying in the, you know, pastoral prayer, prayers of the people in your service somewhat regularly for God to raise up people to serve in this church and to give these gifts of the church, that he has a way of answering that. And so something we often overlook, but just said, I think you'll be surprised how God will answer that prayer. And then there are little things. I mean, there's always a couple guys, I think this guy might be good. And so try to be intentional just to give them more public facing ministry opportunities, whether it's praying before like a church meal or just little things like that. Give them some time so others can see them. But I would say the most important thing actually goes back to that funnel, where if you can kind of change the church culture where that funnel is really wide at the beginning. And so, for instance, for us, we require someone have 2 nominations in order to be considered to start the training, which I found to be a good threshold. But that's not a very high threshold, right? And to make it very easy to nominate. So we have an online form. It's open for about a month. We don't require that people talk to them ahead of time, because that can often not allow people to get nominated. So we'll have something like 70, I think maybe the last time we did it, we had like 70 individual nominations for a total of maybe 12 guys. Right? So that's that big funnel. And what always is amazing is there's guys that I thought maybe showed some potential, but wasn't sure, but someone else saw them in a setting and they nominated them. And so even if they're only known by maybe 6 people in the church, those couple people saw them and nominated them. And now the training process is designed to give them that opportunity to be seen by the rest of the church. And so it's actually pretty amazing. And I realize different churches have different cultures, but it's been pretty amazing for me to see a guy who's maybe a little newer to the church, who wasn't real public, was seen by a few, which puts him into the process, which allows him to be seen by the whole church, confirms his calling. And now we have a guy who's serving wonderfully as an elder, who maybe we would have had to wait 3 more years if we'd kind of followed that more traditional path.
Sometimes and I don't know how large your congregation is, John, but my church is 100.
In Utah, everything is small.
Everything is small. You said 70 nominations. They just think like, man.
Well, those are 70 nominations for about 12 people.
Yeah, I know. I had to like pry my people last. Last summer, I begged them. I'm like, please nominate people. Please, on my hands and knees. How can you encourage then a culture of this wide funnel that you're talking about? Besides the pleas of the pastor saying we need at least one more elder to be viable. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to shifting the whole culture of how the church thinks about it. I mean, again, I'll say it, the prayer piece, just praying publicly for this, I think really does bear fruit. And then it's changing how people understand the officer training. So like before we did it at one of our congregational meetings, we laid out the whole process before we started it to show them, look, we want you, if you're thinking about nominating a guy, we want you to err on the side of nominating him, because here's the process that is designed well so that we will look into the things that are important in terms of his character. You're going to have plenty of chance to then see him in ministry, which ties into another thing that I think is a little different from how a lot of PCA churches do it, where they actually withhold the names of guys in training for most of the time, which makes sense because you want to make it easier for them to drop out, right? But the problem is then the congregation doesn't have the opportunity to observe them as they're training for that ministry. And so I think it's good to have a short period of time where it's private. You're doing that character vetting, but as soon as you can, make it public so that the congregation can watch these guys. They can get to know them. You can put them in these public roles. And so show the congregation, this is what we're going to do so that 7 months from now, when you vote, your vote isn't just kind of like a rubber stamp based on the sessions saying we recommend them. That's important that you know that we recommend them, but it's also based on you knowing the process we took them through, that was serious, and that you got to see them in ministry and observe them. And I think that then frees the congregation to be more generous with who they nominate. And just tied into that, other little things like I mentioned before, I don't think you should get their permission to nominate someone. Just tell people to nominate them and don't talk to them about it, because that can gum up the process. People can say no for the wrong reasons and do an online form, send out an email every week. Stuff like that can help.
How is it, getting back to the resource that you made, do you expect this to be something that maybe the pastor is reading and so he's thinking through the process and implementing something? Or is your book something that you're handing out and everybody is reading through as you're going through it? Or is that something that you would do more to like on particular topics, like, the shepherd leader or something like that, and take different topics and we'll read through that, but then yours is the resource? Or how does that work? How do you see your resource being used?
Yep. So I'd say it's certainly written for the pastor and then whatever other elders he currently has who are going to work to revamp their training program. So it's not really meant to be the book that you would give every officer candidate. It's meant to be a book that gives you an outline and some kind of principles for how to create your own program. No, that's one of the resources on the website I mentioned, our template. So I know guys that have basically taken that and just changed the church name, which is totally fine. But it's really meant for you to be able to create your own program. I talk in there, if you have existing elders, how do you get them on board with a new program? Because sometimes that can be hard for various reasons. How do you kind of think through some of the guys that you have if you're not sure they would make it through that new program that you want to implement? It's really for pastors and elders thinking through how do we improve our current training program.
So switching it up just a little bit, as you focus on that training program with all the men that have been nominated, some are nominated for elder, some are deacon, and some are to be determined, how does the content differ between both elder and deacon candidates?
Yep. So I mentioned there's different phases of the training. And the first phase, that vetting phase, checking character, capacity, calling, is the same for everybody. Next, there's a teaching phase. And the first half of that is the same for everybody. And that's kind of the foundational stuff. That's when we go through the BCO, the Westminster Confession, Bible knowledge, all that stuff. And then halfway through the teaching phase, they split. So there's an elder track and a deacon track, and the elder track's longer. But we schedule it so it kind of alternates weeks. So guys who are still trying to discern can do both. And then that third phase is the training phase where now they're doing the practical ministry. And again, that looks different for elders and deacons. So for elders, it's a lot of word type ministry stuff. Like experience, they're going to lead worship a few times. They're going to lead some sort of Bible study a few times. I have them preach or exhort, depending on, particular, you want to get the terminology so that the congregation can see them up there handling God's word. Deacons, the big one we do is have them organize a work day. I find that captures a lot of the skills needed for deacon. Can they recruit people? Can they plan stuff? Can they get stuff done? And so first half training program's all the same. Second half splits into 2 tracks.
Yeah, and as you've been, this comes out of your process of trying to figure out how to do training and building it from the ground up. I was just thinking of somebody that is looking at this for the first time. That's probably somebody who searched out this. They're doing it for the first time or they're revamping their program. What's something, number one, that you'd give as advice to that sort of person, but also kind of coming from something surprising that you learned in the process? You're like, I wish I would have known this earlier when I was starting this.
Yeah, those are good questions. I think advice is to do it well. It's a lot of work and it's going to require sacrifice on your part to do it. I think this goes back to kind of the broader theme of, I think so much of ministry is leadership, and we don't do a good job of helping teach guys some principles of leadership. And I think this is your ability to lead guys through something hard like this is going to be a test of your leadership. But the advice that I give them is, on the back end, it's going to be so worth it, because I've seen the fruit when you have fellow elders and deacons who meet those character qualifications, who love the Lord, who love this particular church, and have just all done this hard thing together. It creates that bond of brotherhood that makes ministry beautiful and joyous. Even when you're going through hard times, you've all been through the hard training before, and so you have that camaraderie. And so I would say, that the prize is worth it, even though it takes some work. And I would say, I don't know if it's quite surprising thing, but the thing that I always just enjoy as I've gone through this, and I'm reminded how good it is just that camaraderie that develops among the guys as they go through the training. This maybe goes back to your earlier question of why I like to do it when we have a handful of guys. So I think typically, we start out with a lot. By the time people drop out, we usually have between like 4 and 6 guys with the mixed elder deacon candidates. And it's just, there's that camaraderie that you all develop because you're doing these hard things together. And that's really sweet and something I enjoy every single time.
You referenced it a little, but what does the sequence for this look like at your church? When does training start? When does nominating start? What is the timeline for how you train men for office?
Yeah. So for us, we run the program typically every 3 years. We've done it one time. I think there's a 2-year gap. It's because we needed a couple more elders. And what I found works well for us is we do training. We open up nominations in November for about a month. And then training kicks off in, I guess, end of November. And then you have the training, the meetings through about May when we do their final exams with the session. And then the congregational vote is usually sometime mid to late May. And we then install them, ordain them in June. And just on that too, because there's different views on how long to have, right? Like some guys will do something pretty short, maybe a 6-week training program. I know some guys have a really long one. I've found I just love that about 6-month time frame because it's not so long that it feels like it drags on forever. It's long enough that it tests the guys that are in it. And it's not just a 100-yard dash. Like it's going to be more of a marathon, so you can get them over the long haul. But again, it's not so long that by the time you're done, you're so worn out, you feel like you need to wait forever before you start doing another program.
Yeah, our current process starts in August and then finishes at the end of January with the vote. So it's about 6 months all in. And it sometimes feels a little crunched between written exams and oral exams.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we spend typically all fall, every week in the fall, in class and things of that nature.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think, again, one misconception I think a lot of guys have is the training process isn't meant to give them all the information they need to be able to serve as an elder or deacon. In the same way that all of us, I'm sure, after seminary, even though you spent 3-4 years learning stuff, you realized, one guy said, the best part about seminary is it teaches you all the things you don't learn in seminary. Everybody before seminary thinks every question will be answered, right? And then you realize most of them aren't. And we then spend the first 5 years of our ordained ministry kind of learning how to be a pastor, right? But hopefully you have that foundation. And it's the same with officer training. We want to make sure we have the right raw materials of, I keep going back to those two things, the character, the calling, and the capacity. And if they have that, well, then those first 3 years of them serving as an elder deacon are now going to be kind of growing in the maturity to actually do that work.
Well, if we're kind of nearing the end of some of this, I wonder if there's some last things you want to say about use of this resource, or anything that you want to say just about the training process in general that we haven't asked you a question on. If we were to ask you a question that you really want to answer right now, what would that be?
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of one. I think we hit a lot of them. It's I'll just reiterate the piece of there. I want to lay out that vision of, and I'm sure you guys have seen it, good elders and deacons are such a blessing to the church, right? To your own personal ability to do ministry and to the health of the church. And so I know all of us pastors, most of us are solo pastors or feel like we don't have a bunch extra time, but the ability to invest in good training will produce dividends on the back end, and so just encourage guys to do that. The only thing I'd add is, the book is there. I've got the website that has a lot of the resources for free that you can download, the templates and other stuff. And then been talking with a few presbyteries about doing like a seminar. And so that's something, if any of the listeners are interested in, or if there's a church, I love teaching about this. And so if there's any churches or a presbytery that'd be interested in trying to host some sort of seminar on this topic, would love to be able to connect about that.
Well, I'm sorry I was so quiet. I'm sure the listeners don't mind. But Scott and Jared are in positions where they're doing more training for officers than I am. I'm an associate minister, and it's not one of my responsibilities whenever it comes up. So I like to just listen to these conversations. I think at this point, I would say everybody go buy the book and read it. I'm sure that John would be glad for everybody to do that. But seriously,
another McDonald's date night.
That's right. I was sitting here kind of thumbing through your howtotrainelders.com. This is fantastic. It's just a one page. You've got 5 links, and it is, everything you would need to train elders and deacons is right here. And so, anyway, I'll put that link in the show notes too. So go check that out, guys. And I think we said it off the air, but I'm going to put a note in here too that you did go on the M&A podcast. I forget what it's called. With Chris Vogel, and talk about this as well. Mm-hmm. So if you guys want to hear John talk more about these kinds of things, there's another place you can go on the internet and hear some more. So we would commend that to you as well. I rambled for a second there. Does anybody want to say anything else? Anything else we want to tell anybody? All right. Well, listeners, I think any good elder or deacon would say that this podcast is over. Thank you for joining us. The show notes are there. You know where to find them. If you've got questions or comments, you can shoot those to us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. Make sure you're following us on social media. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast in your podcast app of choice. And stay tuned. We'll be back in the Directory for Worship before too much longer, and we hope that you'll join us there. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, John.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Y'all take care.